The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, casting long, soft shadows across the living room. It had been nearly 2 months since Mark passed away. The grief that had once been a raw, suffocating weight in my chest had gradually settled into a dull ache, a quiet sadness that lingered in the background of my daily life. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. There was a silence that had replaced the sound of his laughter, the creak of his old shoes on the wooden floors, and even the soft hum of his guitar, as he strummed absent-mindedly while watching TV. I had always known that the day would come when I'd have to go through his things, his clothes, books, old photographs, and papers, sorting through them, deciding what to keep and what to donate. But I hadn't been ready. I had put it off for as long as I could. Mark's desk, however, had been one of the hardest places to face. It wasn't just a desk, it had always been his domain. The place where he worked, where he stored his thoughts, his dreams, and sometimes his secrets. I had no idea what I might find, but I was certain that there would be pieces of him I didn't know about. It wasn't that we had a bad marriage. On the contrary, we had been happy, or at least I thought we had been. But there were moments, those fleeting little things that made me wonder. Mark was a complicated person, and despite being married for almost 15 years, there were corners of his soul that remained uncharted, hidden from me in ways I could never fully understand. I never questioned his love for me, but it wasn't difficult to see that he kept parts of his past locked away, even from me. That, I suppose, was what drew me to his desk that day, the desire to know more, to understand him in a way I hadn't before. I had already gone through much of his office, sorting his papers, organizing his books, finding a collection of pens that he had gathered over the years, some of which had stories I was sure I would never know. His workspace was meticulously neat, as if he had always known exactly where everything went. The only thing left untouched was the lower drawer on his desk. It was a deep locked drawer, hidden from view behind the stack of old notebooks and files that lined the top. I had never paid it much attention before, not even when we were both still alive. It seemed insignificant at the time, just another drawer filled with things that weren't worth bothering about. But that morning something felt different. I was overcome with an odd, almost magnetic pull toward that drawer. The others had been so easy to go through. Papers to shred, books to donate, clothes to pack up, but this one felt like a door I shouldn't open, even though the urge to do so was undeniable. Maybe it was because I knew that I would find something there. Something that might hurt me or break the image of Mark I had carried in my mind for so long. I sat on the edge of his chair, staring at the drawer. The key had always been a mystery. Mark had always had a place for everything. A place for his keys, his passwords, his hidden moments. I had never thought to ask him where it was. But there it was, lying innocently in the top drawer of the kitchen, nestled between old bills and receipts, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. The key was small and unremarkable, just a simple brass thing with a faded tag attached to it. It didn't have any markings, no notes or hints, but it fit perfectly in the lock. I turned it slowly, the metal groaning as the mechanism clicked open. As the drawer opened, I felt an involuntary shiver run down my spine. Inside there were several items that caught my eye. At first glance it seemed like the kind of drawer you'd expect to find in a writer's office. Papers, old journals, pens, and a few odd trinkets. But underneath a pile of receipts and faded photos, something caught my eye. A plain white envelope. It was yellowed with age, the edges frayed. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was Mark's. But what struck me most was the name written underneath his, Laura. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't recognize the name. It wasn't a name I had ever heard Mark mention before. I turned the envelope over, holding my breath, and saw that there were no other markings. No return address, no other identifying information, just the name Laura. My mind raced with questions. Who was Laura? Was this a letter from an old friend? A business associate? Or something more? I felt an intense, almost primal need to know what was inside. I carefully pulled the letter out of the envelope, my hands trembling. The paper was old, delicate, and it smelled faintly of lavender, which struck me as odd. Mark had never had a particular fondness for flowers. The letter itself was written in neat, cursive handwriting, different from Mark's, and the ink was slightly faded in places. I took a deep breath and began to read. The first few lines were filled with words of longing. The writer spoke of a love that had once been fierce and all-consuming, but which had been lost over time. The letter described a deep and painful separation, one that had clearly left scars. The more I read, the more my chest tightened. It was clear from the tone that this was no ordinary letter. It was a confession, a declaration of emotions that had never been shared, emotions that had been buried beneath years of silence. As I read on, my heart began to race. The writer, Laura, was speaking to Mark about their past together, how they had been in love before he and I had ever met. She spoke of their shared memories, the moments that had shaped their relationship, and the reasons why they had parted ways. I learned that Laura had left Mark many years ago, abruptly and without explanation. She had simply vanished, and though Mark had tried to reach out to her, she had never responded. But what struck me the most were the final words of the letter. "I will always love you, even if we never meet again." I felt as though the room around me had suddenly closed in. I couldn't breathe. I stared at the words for what felt like an eternity. There was something intimate about this letter, something that had been hidden for years, something Mark had never spoken about, not even to me. The letter didn't mention a specific date, and it didn't seem to have been written recently. It felt like something from the distant past, but it was still a secret, a piece of Mark's history that I had never known existed. My mind was spinning. What did this mean? Was this why Mark had always seemed distant at times, as if there were something unspoken, some deep well of emotion that he had never allowed himself to fully access? Had he loved Laura more than he had ever loved me? Or had their love simply been a fleeting moment in his life, one that had long since been buried under years of commitment and responsibility? I sat there, holding the letter, unable to make sense of what I had just discovered. The silence in the room was deafening. My heart hurt in ways I couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't jealousy that I felt. At least, I didn't think it was. It was something deeper, something more confusing. Betrayal? Regret? Loss? Or was it just the overwhelming realization that there had been a part of Mark's life that I had never truly known? I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, but the questions swirled inside my mind like a storm. Who was Laura, really? Why had she written this letter now, after all these years? And what did it mean for me? Could I ever look at Mark's memory the same way again? I couldn't answer any of those questions right away. All I could do was sit there in the quiet, clutching the letter to my chest, feeling a deep sense of sorrow and confusion that I couldn't shake. The discovery of that letter had opened a door to a past I never knew existed, and I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through it. The room around me felt smaller as I sat there, frozen, my hands trembling ever so slightly as they held the fragile envelope. The letter inside felt heavier than any physical weight. Each word seemed to carry a lifetime of emotion, regret, and longing. It was clear now that what I had stumbled upon was no ordinary discovery. It wasn't just a forgotten note or a trivial piece of correspondence. It was a relic of Mark's past, one that had been carefully hidden away for reasons I could not yet understand. The question that haunted me was simple. Why? Why had Mark kept it, and why had he kept it from me? I stared at the envelope for a long time, still in a kind of disbelief. The name Laura had been written on the front in a hand I didn't recognize. The handwriting was elegant, almost delicate, like someone who had taken their time to pour out their feelings on the page. It was a far cry from Mark's usual scrawl. My thoughts raced, trying to piece together what I had learned from the few words I had read. Laura. I had never heard of her before. But the letter had made it clear that she wasn't just someone from Mark's past. She had been someone important, someone whose memory had evidently stayed with him long after their separation. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I tried to steady my breathing, but the emotions swirling in my chest were too much to contain. I had to read it again. Slowly, carefully, I unfolded the letter once more, the paper now seeming even more fragile than it had moments earlier. I had to know everything. Every detail. I had to understand what Mark had kept locked away from me, what part of his heart he had never shared. I began reading from the start, my eyes scanning the words with an intensity one hadn't felt in years. The letter began with an outpouring of emotion, a confession of love that had never been fully expressed. Laura had written about their time together, about the connection they had shared. Her words were full of longing, of moments that had been lost to time, but not forgotten. As I read, I could almost feel her presence in the room with me, her spirit echoing in the spaces between the lines. It was clear that their relationship had been intense, passionate even. They had shared experiences, dreams, and intimacies that had shaped their bond in a way that I couldn't begin to understand. I felt a pang in my chest as I realized that Mark had never shared any of this with me. I had always known that he had a past, but this was more than just a series of memories. It was a deep, lasting connection, one that seemed to have never fully faded, even after all these years. I read further, my heart racing as I tried to absorb the complexity of what was being revealed. Laura had left Mark. That was the key fact that ran through her letter like a thread, connecting everything together. She spoke of the pain she had caused him when she had abruptly ended their relationship, how she had left without explanation, and how Mark had tried to reach out to her, to understand why she had made the decision to walk away. But she had never responded. The words she wrote were filled with regret, an acknowledgement that she had made a mistake, one that she had lived with for years. I could feel the tension in the letter, an emotional weight that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Laura seemed to be saying goodbye in the most profound way she knew how. She spoke of never being able to fully erase the memories of their time together, of the love they had shared, and of the regret that had followed her for so long. I had to stop reading for a moment, taking in what I had learned. The pain in her words was almost tangible, a reminder that love could be as beautiful as it was destructive. But it was the last few lines of the letter that hit me the hardest. I will always love you, even if we never meet again. The weight of that statement crushed me. I had always believed that Mark's love for me was unwavering, that we had built a life together on a foundation of shared memories and deep affection. But here in this letter was the admission that he had once loved someone else, someone with a love that had not been fully severed, someone whose presence in his heart had remained long after she had left. I couldn't help but wonder, did he still love her? Was I just the one who came after? The questions were like daggers in my chest, and I couldn't shake them no matter how hard I tried. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, holding the letter and staring at the words on the page. I had never expected to find something like this. Never imagined that the man I had spent 15 years with had once shared a love so deep and profound. The realization was unsettling, to say the least. But there was something else, something that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. Laura's letter was not just a memory of the past. It was an invitation, a reaching out across time, almost as if she was still hoping to find closure, to bridge the gap that had existed between them for so long. But why now? Why had she written this letter so many years after their relationship had ended? And why had Mark never mentioned her to me? There were so many unanswered questions, and each one made the sense of betrayal that much more painful. It wasn't just that Mark had kept a secret from me. It was the fact that this secret had been so personal, so deeply ingrained in his history. The emotional bond that Laura represented had never truly been broken. I had married a man who had carried a piece of his past with him, a past that I had never been a part of. I felt a deep sense of isolation wash over me. How many other things had Mark kept hidden? How many other parts of his heart had I never known about? I had always prided myself on the strength of our relationship, on the closeness we shared. But now, I felt as though the foundation of our marriage had been shaken. Was there something I had missed? Had he been keeping other things from me, things I would never understand? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't prepared to face. I had always believed that I knew Mark, that I understood him in a way that no one else could. But now I wasn't so sure. There were pieces of him, significant pieces that I had never known. And as much as I wanted to believe that it was all in the past, something told me that the shadow of Laura's letter would follow me for a long time to come. I sat back in the chair, staring at the envelope in my hands, unsure of what to do next. I thought about Mark, about our life together. We had been happy, or so I had believed. But now, I wasn't sure if I had ever truly known him. His past with Laura, this love that had once been so real, so intense, seemed to loom over everything. It was as though I had been living in the shadow of a love I hadn't even known existed. And that was the hardest part to bear. The fact that Mark had never shared it with me. He had kept it hidden, locked away, even from the person he had chosen to spend his life with. I knew that I couldn't simply ignore what I had found. I had to understand it, to confront it. I needed to know why Mark had never spoken of Laura, and what this letter meant for me. I couldn't just let it go. The truth was, the discovery of this letter had opened a door to a past I wasn't prepared to explore. But I had no choice. I had to know more. The next few days passed in a blur. I went through the motions of daily life, but my thoughts were consumed by Laura's letter. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the words she had written, hear the unspoken emotions that seemed to echo in her plea. And as much as I wanted to forget about it, to go back to the life I had known before, I knew that I couldn't. Something had shifted. I couldn't erase the past, no matter how hard I tried. And I didn't know if I wanted to. The truth, as painful as it was, had to be faced. I wasn't sure how to move forward, but I knew one thing for certain. This letter had changed everything. The days that followed were a blur. The letter had left me reeling, my mind constantly circling back to Laura and the life Mark had shared with her long before we had ever met. I couldn't escape the haunting question of why he had never told me about her. Why had he kept this part of his past hidden from me? I had known him for years, had shared a life with him, but this revelation felt like a stranger had entered our relationship. How could someone who had been so close to me, who had shared his thoughts, his heart, and his life with me, have concealed something so significant for all these years? The letter had awakened a storm of doubt that I couldn't silence. The image I had of our life together was starting to crack. Each new thought a shard of glass that made it harder to hold on to the version of reality I had always believed in. It wasn't that I doubted our love or the years we had spent together. It was that I couldn't stop thinking about the parts of Mark's heart that I had never known. What if there were other secrets? What if I had never truly understood him? The possibility made my chest tighten, and my thoughts scatter. I found myself scrutinizing every little detail of our life together, trying to find the missing pieces, the things I had missed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Mark had always been a man of contradictions. He was open with me about so much, yet there had always been walls, parts of him that remained locked away. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, the letter once again lying in front of me. I couldn't bring myself to burn it, to tear it up, or to ignore it. It was too important, too full of emotion, too full of unanswered questions. I had been turning the idea of confronting Mark in my mind for days, replaying what I would say, how I would approach it. But the truth was, I didn't know if I was ready for the answers. I had a deep, gnawing need to speak with someone who might understand this. Someone who might know more about Laura, about their relationship, and perhaps most importantly, why Mark had never spoken of her. I had avoided asking Mark's friends and family about her. I didn't know why, but something inside me told me it would be wrong to bring it up, to speak of someone he had left behind so long ago. But I couldn't keep running from this any longer. The silence was suffocating, and every day that passed without confronting it made it worse. I had spent the better part of that week replaying every moment of my marriage, every laugh, every argument, every silence. It felt as though I was living in a memory that was now clouded by the truth of the letter. There were moments when I thought I could see the shadows of Laura, like faint echoes of a life that was no longer present, but still lingering in the background. Could Mark have still loved her? Could there have been a part of him that never truly let her go? The thought plagued me constantly. I had never believed in the concept of the one that got away, but now, sitting with the letter in my hands, I was questioning everything. The letter had been so personal, so raw. I knew I needed to understand more about it. What had their relationship been like? Why had she left him? And why had Mark never reached out to her again? These were questions that I couldn't simply let go unanswered. I had to know, even if it hurt. After days of contemplation, I finally decided to try to find Laura. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I felt conflicted about it. I didn't know what I would find or how it would affect me, but I couldn't keep wondering about her. I had to know the answers, and I couldn't live with the constant gnawing sense of uncertainty. I needed closure. I started by looking through old letters and notes Mark had kept. I rifled through piles of papers and files, trying to find any clue that might lead me to her. There were no phone numbers or addresses, no mention of Laura except for the letter itself. There was nothing in the address book, no old photographs, no mention in any conversations. It was as if she had never existed in the life Mark had built after their time together. I found myself growing more frustrated by the minute. I had expected to find something, anything, that could guide me to her. But I found nothing. The mystery of Laura deepened, and with it my sense of unease. It wasn't until I looked at the back of the envelope that I saw it. A faintly written address, almost hidden beneath a fold in the paper. It wasn't a traditional street address but more of a post office box. It was a start, and that was enough. My heart raced as I quickly jotted down the information, feeling a mix of dread and anticipation. I knew this was the right thing to do, but the reality of it made my stomach churn. What was I hoping to find? What would I say to her when I did? The next few days were filled with uncertainty. I sent a letter to the post office box I had found, unsure of whether Laura still lived there. Unsure if she would even respond. I wasn't even sure what I would say to her, but I wrote honestly, asking her to tell me about her relationship with Mark, about their time together, and why she had disappeared from his life. I needed to understand. I needed to know what had been left unsaid. The waiting was unbearable. I had no idea how long it would take for her to receive my letter, or if she would even respond at all. Each day felt longer than the last, and I couldn't focus on anything else. Everything seemed to circle back to that letter, and the questions it had raised. I thought about Mark, and I thought about Laura, about how their lives had intersected and then diverged. Had she loved him? Had he loved her? What had happened between them? And why hadn't he told me? I couldn't escape it, couldn't stop thinking about it. Then one afternoon there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a woman standing on the porch, holding an envelope in her hand. She was older than I expected, in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, with short dark hair and an air of quiet sadness about her. She didn't introduce herself at first, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the same sense of uncertainty that I had felt when I first set out to find her. She handed me the envelope without a word, and I could see that it was postmarked from the same address I had sent my letter to. My heart raced as I took it from her, my fingers trembling slightly. The woman turned and walked away before I could say anything, disappearing down the street. I closed the door behind me, staring at the envelope. It was from Laura, and she had responded. I took the envelope to the kitchen table, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that this was the moment I had been waiting for. As I carefully opened it, I wondered what Laura would say. Would she be angry? Would she be defensive? Or would she be open, sharing her side of the story? I was about to find out. The letter was longer than I had expected, and as I began reading, I felt the weight of her words, the depth of her emotions fill the room. She spoke of her love for Mark, a love that had been intense and real. She described their relationship as something that had consumed her, something that had shaped her in ways she could never truly explain. But she also spoke of the pain of leaving, of the reasons she had made that decision, and how she had carried the guilt and regret with her for years. Laura described the love she had felt for Mark, but also the life she had chosen afterward, a life that had been shaped by that very decision to walk away. She admitted that she had never stopped thinking about him, that she had always wondered how he had turned out, if he had ever found happiness. But the most poignant part of her letter was when she spoke of the silence that had existed between them. She told me that she had never responded to his attempts to reach out to her because she had been afraid that revisiting their past would only bring more pain, that it would undo everything she had tried to move past. Laura had never truly believed that Mark had been able to let go of her, and in her heart, she had always known that their love had remained unfinished. Reading her letter was like peeling back another layer of the truth, one that had been buried for so long. It was as though I was learning about Mark in a way I had never known before. The questions that had tormented me were being answered, but with each answer came new complexities, new feelings that I didn't know how to handle. I couldn't decide whether I felt sorrow, understanding, or betrayal. All of those emotions were intertwined in a way that left me unsure of where I stood. The truth was clearer now, but it was harder to digest than I had ever anticipated. The weight of Laura's letter had settled over me like a heavy fog. As I sat in the kitchen, still clutching the envelope she had given me, I felt as though I were suspended between two worlds. The world I had known with Mark, the life we had built, the love we had shared, and the world of revelations, of buried secrets, that had been slowly unfolding before me. It wasn't just the facts that were hard to digest. It was the emotional depth of everything I had learned. Laura's words were so raw, so filled with pain and regret, that it felt as though I were intruding on a deeply personal chapter of Mark's life that had remained hidden from me for all these years. She had loved him, yes, but she had also walked away. And in doing so, she had left a gaping wound in both their hearts that neither of them had ever fully healed. The letter didn't give me all the answers I had hoped for. There was no neat closure, no definitive explanation for why Mark had kept this part of his past from me. But there was something in Laura's words that resonated with me. A sense of understanding, of empathy. She didn't try to justify her actions, she simply explained them. She had left him because, in her own words, the love we shared was too big, too consuming, and I was afraid it would swallow us both whole. She had been young, confused, and had believed that leaving was the only way to save herself from the overwhelming intensity of their connection. But the truth, as she confessed in her letter, was that she had never stopped loving him. The regret she carried with her, the pain of walking away, had never fully gone away. I read the letter 3 times, trying to process it all, trying to make sense of the tangled emotions and the years of silence. Mark had moved on with me, built a life with me. But in the shadows of our relationship, there was still this unresolved past, this lingering ghost of what might have been. And now, standing on the precipice of that truth, I couldn't help but feel betrayed. Not just by Mark, but by the entire idea of our love. Had I been just the second choice? Had Mark ever truly let go of Laura? Was I just someone to fill the void she had left behind? The questions burned in my mind, and with each passing moment, they became harder to ignore. I could no longer pretend that everything was okay, that nothing had changed. Because everything had changed. The life we had built felt fragile now, as if the foundation had been cracked by a single letter. The knowledge that there had been a time, a part of Mark's life, that I had never known about, and would never truly understand, felt like a betrayal in itself. That evening, when Mark came home from work, the weight of the truth seemed to hang between us. He walked in as if nothing had changed, smiling at me as he set down his briefcase and hung up his coat. I didn't smile back. I couldn't. My mind was still racing, the letter burning in my memory, the questions circling like vultures. I knew I had to confront him. I couldn't carry this weight any longer. Mark, I said, my voice calm but firm. We need to talk. He paused for a moment, then nodded, sensing the change in my tone. What's going on? He asked, his eyes narrowing with concern. I stood up from the kitchen table, the letter still in my hand. I didn't know how to begin. I had no script, no plan. But I couldn't avoid this any longer. I found something, I said, looking at him squarely. Something I wasn't supposed to. Mark's face shifted, a subtle tightening of his jaw, a flicker of something behind his eyes that I couldn't quite place. He swallowed hard but didn't speak. His silence was more telling than any words he could have said. What did you find? He asked, his voice quieter now, more guarded. I didn't answer him immediately. Instead, I held out the letter from Laura, the very thing that had thrown my entire world off balance. Mark's face drained of color when he saw it. He looked from the envelope to me, his gaze flickering with a mixture of fear, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite name. You shouldn't have read it, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Why, Mark? I replied, my voice rising slightly. Why didn't you tell me about her? About this? I gestured toward the letter. Why keep this secret for all these years? He looked down, his hands shaking slightly. I never meant for it to come to this. I was trying to protect you. And honestly, I was trying to protect myself too. Laura, she was a huge part of my life. A part one wasn't proud of, a part that still hurts. His voice cracked a little, but he continued. I thought I had moved on, that I was okay. But when she left, it tore me apart in ways I didn't even understand. I didn't know how to explain it to you, how to tell you about her, and what she meant to me without risking losing everything we had. You were my future, and I didn't want my past to come between us. So you kept it hidden? You kept this woman, this love that you shared with her, a secret from me for years? I shook my head in disbelief. How could you do that, Mark? How could you let me love you, knowing that there was this part of you, this big part of you, that you kept locked away? Mark's eyes filled with tears as he stepped closer to me, I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't want you to feel like you were second to anyone. You were always my choice, and I thought that was enough. I thought that if I could bury the past, it would stay buried. I didn't want to drag you into it. I wanted us to be free of all that. But now I see that I was wrong. I should have been honest with you. You deserve to know the truth. The air between us was thick with unspoken emotions. I could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of the years he had carried. And it was clear that he was sorry. But the question still burned in my mind. What about Laura? He had loved her, yes. He had never stopped. How could I reconcile that with the man who stood in front of me? The man I had married, the man I thought I knew. I don't know if I can understand this, Mark, I said quietly, my voice trembling. I don't know if I can forgive you for keeping this from me, for not telling me the truth. He took a step back, his face pained. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. But I hope you'll understand that everything I've done, I did because I was trying to protect us, protect you. And I thought that by not telling you about Laura, I could shield you from the hurt I felt. But now I see that it's not about shielding you. It's about being honest, about sharing everything, even the parts that hurt. The silence between us grew heavy, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. I don't know what to do, Mark. I don't know how to move forward from here. This changes everything. I don't know if I can just erase all of this, all of the questions and doubts that have been flooding my mind since I found the letter. Mark stepped forward again, his hand reaching for mine. I don't expect you to erase anything. All I can do is ask you to believe in me, to believe in us. I never wanted to hurt you, and I can't change the past, but I can be here, in this moment with you, telling you the truth. I pulled my hand back, unsure of what to say. I didn't know if I could move past this. I didn't know if I could look at Mark and not see the shadow of Laura hovering between us. The weight of everything felt crushing, and I wasn't sure if I could bear it. But I also knew that I couldn't make any decisions in the heat of the moment. I needed time. I needed space to think and to process everything that had come to light. Maybe we need some time apart, I said softly, my voice cracking. Maybe we need to figure out who we are now without all of these secrets. Mark nodded slowly, his face filled with both relief and sadness. I understand. I'll give you whatever time you need. Just know that I love you, and I always will. And I will always regret not being honest with you. I left the room, my heart heavy with the uncertainty of the future. The road ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. Things had irrevocably changed. The past, with all its secrets and unspoken truths, was no longer something I could ignore. And whether we could rebuild our relationship, or whether it would shatter under the weight of it all, I didn't know. But I was no longer the woman I had been before I found that letter. And neither was Mark. Our love, our lives had been altered by the truth. And now, all we could do was try to find our way through the wreckage.